Everybody. So now we have discussed about necrosis. So today I am going to explain the different types of necrosis. So there are six types of necrosis: coagulative necrosis, liquefactive necrosis, gangrenous necrosis, caseous necrosis, fat necrosis, and fibrinoid necrosis. Now, what is coagulative necrosis? As we discussed that in necrosis, structural and functional proteins they just undergo denaturation and the cell ultimately dies. So in coagulative necrosis, what happens with the structural and functional proteins? They simultaneously undergo denaturation, and the result is that the architecture of that tissue that remains the same, that is maintained for a few days until the mediators that are released by that necrotic tissue, as we know that the injured tissue will release different mediators, and that mediators will attract different immune cells, and that immune cells will come to the necrotic area, and then they will start digesting that tissue. Until that tissue architecture will be maintained. Now under microscope, they will that necrotic tissue, the coagulative necrosis area will show some distinct changes. That will be like the cytoplasm will be appear as eosinophilic and the cells will be anucleated, means that there will no nucleus inside the cells. Like here we can see that this tissue will appear as like this under microscope, and there will be like eosinophilic cytoplasms, but there we can see that there are no nucleus inside these cells. Now the next type is liquefactive necrosis. Now what happens in liquefactive necrosis? The structure proteins undergo denaturation. Okay, their structure is denatured, so that denatured structure will not be able to hold different enzymes now. So the hydrolytic enzymes will be released like from the lysosomes, and they will start intense enzymatic digestion. They will convert the tissue into liquid type material, and at the end we see a liquid type material, that's the name liquefactive necrosis. So this enzymatic digestion could be autolysis or hydrolysis, means that it could be the cell's own enzymes or could be the enzymes from outside can do so. And one important thing is that this type of necrosis is common in bacterial infections, and because the bacteria can also release toxins that can in enzymes that can damage the tissue. In abscess, like neutrophils are use proteolytic enzymes that liquefy the tissue that is pus, and that is also the example of liquefactive necrosis. Here we can see the brain, and that is the tissue that has undergone liquefactive necrosis. So liquefactive necrosis is most common in the brain tissue. Now let's talk about the third type, that is gangrenous necrosis. And I just wrote it in a very simple wording, and if you will read this, you will be able to understand what I am talking about. So in gangrenous necrosis, what happens that extensive tissue necrosis happens, and the important thing is that this is complicated by secondary bacterial infection. There are three types of gangrene: dry gangrene, wet gangrene, and gas gangrene. So in the dry gangrene, what happens? There is arterial blood flow obstruction. Whatever the reason is, there are many reasons, and the venous drainage is not impaired. As a result, the tissue is dry. And also, the superimposed bacterial infections are not very severe. So morphology is that the necrotic tissue will appear black, dry, and will be clearly demarcated from the neighboring normal tissue, and we can tell it by closely saying that this area is damaged. And it is very common in extremities of body such as toe and feet, etc. Then wet gangrene. This type, the obstruction is of in both, like arteries and veins both get obstructed. So the tissue will be wet and there will be very severe infections. This type of necrosis is, this type of gangrene is very common in internal organs like the gut, the GIT, in intestines like in uterus. Gas gangrene, what happens that when the deep wounds, when contaminated by the C. perfringens, they cause gas production there. In the area is in the gas bubbles we can be see there, and that is the gas gangrene. Okay, so now let's see its morphology. Here you can see that this is the example of the dry gangrene, and you can see the tissue is necrosed, and we can grossly able to differentiate between the necrotic area and the normal area. So this is the wet gangrene, and you can see that we can't differentiate between the normal healthy tissue and the necrosed tissue. So these are the intestines, and you can see that all intestines are swollen and in wet, in it's very severe and it's very lethal. It could take someone's life, so it's very important to know about these types. So the next types will be discussed in our next part of the video. Thank you.